Hey, everybody. Welcome to Deep Dive. I'm Shane.
I'm Amy.
And this week we are going to follow up on our You Ask For It Sunday, where you submitted questions and we answer them. So we're going to do our best to try to answer your really difficult, complicated questions today. So stick around. All right. So our first question this week on You Ask For It is a really easy one. Yeah. So here we go. Ready?
Yeah.
Are you ready? This comes to us from one of our church members, and it goes like this. It is, does God change God's mind?
Does God change God's
Does
mind?
God change God's mind?
So I think it's interesting to kind of think about Scripture for this question. So certainly we have in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, these instances of, certain figures kind of negotiating with God in certain ways. That's Moses, Abraham,
Job. Yeah.
Yes. So there are these negotiations that go on that certainly seem like God changes God's mind. And then,
I guess Job's not successful. But
No, right.
Yeah.
But then I think, I would point to kind of the example of Jesus. Actually, in the garden, we're about to head into the season of Lent, but Jesus asking God to take this cup. And if that was not something that was possible, then this example of Jesus asking this of God would seem peculiar to me.
Yeah, it is interesting because I feel like I've said prayers in my life that I'm praying for something that I know, or at least I feel is not possible, but I'm still praying for it. And I've often, just my interpretive lens, that's the way I've interpreted some of Jesus's things, that it's just not possible or probable. But yeah, it's a tough question.
It is. And I think part of it too is like, if we're talking about God's changing God's mind, what does that mean really? Do you know what I mean? Like even so you can point to Scripture of these times that there are these negotiations between humans and God, and that's one level I think of that question.
Yeah.
But then, what does that mean? What does it mean?
Yeah, I think on the big cosmic stuff, God's not going to change God's mind.
Right.
God's not going to be, well, I've set up this whole thing with Jesus and the way that we can redeem humanity. But just kidding. I don't think that's going to happen. But I think some of those things have to do with things that are driven by God's character or things that become a little more arbitrary, that there are multiple ways of doing that within God's character. So I don't think God is in the business of changing God's character. God is not going to become ungracious, But I think we as, if we are created in the image of God, we recognize that there are multiple ways to do things sometimes that are within the character of grace or the character of love. There's multiple ways to love someone. And so I think if it falls into that category of there's another way to love it, I do think there is an openness to God. I'm enough of a process theologian to believe that there's a genuine openness to God's character, that God might be swayed in those ways. I also think from a personal relational standpoint, there is value to arguing to God. There's something in that mix of sort of arguing with God and seeing if God would change. And there's something learning about that. It's like the adage where someone says God's answer to prayer is sometimes yes, no, or wait. And there's something about that interaction that is formative to us, even if the end result isn't God is swayed and changes God's mind.
Absolutely. So that was actually kind of my next place I was going to go.
Sorry, I stole it. Yeah, go ahead.
No. Talking about the character of God. And if we're talking about changing minds, does that equate to changing character? I don't think so.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I think that's important to hold up. And then I think you alluded to a little bit something else that I would talk about, which is, particularly let's just use Abraham and Moses as this example, that even that kind of experience of being in relationship and talking and, being able to give reasons, to really helps you to dig into what it is that you truly believe and need and feel called to yourself, just in that process of communicating with God.
Yeah, and I think I always try to think of what's the stressor that provokes these questions, and I think the stressor is when when you feel in a trap situation or you feel like extreme frustration, I think we can get sort of like been around the pole of thinking, well, should I even be praying for change?
Yeah.
And should I even be thinking about that? Because if God is unchangeable, why should I should just say, your will be done. Well, I think you can pray for change and say your will be done at the same time. And so, if as a pastor here to relieve that stress, I would encourage anyone with this question, by all means, pray for God, but to change God's mind. Please do, because even if God doesn't change God's mind or God doesn't give you the answer you desire, there's something in that process of sanctification and discipleship that you are going to learn more about yourself, learn more about God in a deepening situation. I've been with enough people in end of life, hospice situations and conversations to realize that even if God doesn't miraculously come in and create instant healing, God's presence can be found there. And it's strange to say, but it's generally what happens is someone finds a great deal of peace in the midst of that struggle.
Yeah. And so the formative nature of just being open to being in that process, no matter the outcome.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so the next question we got from the congregation is also an easy one, so it's perfect.
Yeah.
And that question is, why did Jesus have to die?
Oh, man. Boy, this question is a can of worms. So first, I'll say I think this is a really interesting question because this is I feel like this is the question. It's its time in the box to be examined in our day and age, because it goes hand in hand with the questions about substitutionary atonement. We'll get into that in a little bit, but I feel like every age the church is evaluating complicated questions, and I feel like in this age this is the question we're evaluating. So I can just say where I'm at on that, but it's not 100% at it. So. First, I would reject the premise of the question.
Okay. What does that mean?
Okay. So I don't think Jesus had to die.
Okay.
I think it is the logical end of what he was committed to. But that doesn't necessarily mean God and Jesus and in heaven or wherever it's in a conversation with the Holy Spirit be like, well, I feel like I really need to send you down there and get killed. There's a difference between that in almost this conversation where God's like, well, we're gonna do this incarnation thing, but you know what that means, right? You're probably gonna get killed. And to me, those are two similar but very different things. And so I'm much more in that latter one of Jesus is such a subversive figure that what's bound to happen as a revolutionary, because he has enormous amounts of, it's interesting. Lent, right before Easter is Palm Sunday, and Palm Sunday is probably the perfect context to talk about this in, because it is Jesus entering in this, the triumphal entry, entering in this way where they have just crowds and crowds of the poor and the desperate entering. And scholars will tell us that he's entering in a way that's definitely like a parody of the way a Roman general would enter with, legions of people showing their power, where Jesus is coming riding humble on a donkey, whereas a Roman general or a ruler governor would have been riding in on a war horse. And so from that perspective, it's much more easy to see that Jesus would be perceived by Rome as a revolutionary. Gospel, good news. I'm sharing good news literally is a Roman term about the good news of Rome, which is typically about rebellions they'd put down or places they'd conquered. And so to me, when I look at the life of Jesus, I say he is so committed to what he's about to do, which he outlines particularly in Luke when he opens the scroll in that early synagogue and he just says, good news to the poor, release to the captives. Well, that is upsetting stuff from the Roman perspective. And so let's not get this wrong. He was a political execution. That is the part of the narrative. And so over the centuries, we start spiritualizing aspects of that. And certainly we should and engage in those things. But from its raw basic standpoint, he was killed as he was accused of sedition and killed some of our creeds literally say that, accused of sedition and killed by Rome. And so from that perspective, I don't think Jesus had to die in order to accomplish his goal, but accomplishes his goal included death, because if he were to compromise his mission or in order to preserve his life, it would have compromised what he was trying to accomplish. Does that make sense? Yeah.
The funny thing is, I don't really know how, but I agree with you 100%.
Okay.
Especially for it to be such a kind of hard and multi-layered question, but I really do agree with you. I mean, that is my view of Jesus and his life and what he felt very called to. We've talked before about the preferential treatment for the poor, and in the midst of empire, those are some pretty hard words, especially if you have people who start to follow you.
Yeah. And Jesus accepting his death is a stunning subversive act of resistance. To relate it to this Sunday, we're going to be talking about the temptation, and the temptation is for Jesus to access his godly powers in order to, use those powers to demonstrate his mission. But Jesus in submitting to death on a cross is an act of subversion, because he's showing us what it means to be fully human, that human beings have the capacity to resist oppression, to resist unjustness, to resist all these things, even to the point of death. Human beings have that capacity via the resources of God, the Holy Spirit. And he's willing to demonstrate that. He's willing to not compromise what he believes in, even to the point of death. Now, where this gets really complicated is because if we accept that as a premise, and I'm not saying you should, I'm just saying what I believe, okay? If we accept that and start pulling that back into theology, it really does challenge our understanding of substitutionary atonement, which atonement, I'm sure there's better ways to describe it, but the best way to describe it is it's a very commonly, probably the most held belief about Jesus's death, which is that God required a blood sacrifice to atone for the sins of humanity. Substitutionary atonement. Atonement's a fancy word that just means to make one. So God required a blood sacrifice in order to make us one with God, because, it's been said God can't be in the presence of sin, to use that, the prophet, take the coal, cleanse my lips. I can't be here in the presence of God with the presence of sin. Sin needs to be eradicated. God required blood. And some of that is it maps onto our very overly simplistic understanding of Old Testament sacrifice.
Sure. Oh, absolutely. And so Anselm is one of the church fathers who I would point to. Actually, if you want to read all about kind of the origin of this theory, that would be where I would point you to look up Anselm and do some reading. And really, he obviously was reading, from these kind of texts that you're talking about, but also he was living in a feudal kind of society himself. And so he was looking around at how does law work? How do we experience justice and things being made right? And it caught on, honestly. I mean, it caught on. And so here we are now, and it obviously has stood the test of time and become very widely believed. But really, I would point people as many times as we could to go back and really think about and look and research and study, where do these things that we take for granted, where do they come from? Where do they originate? Because that's 11th century kinds of stuff there, and we take it as, well, of course.
Yeah. And to understand that, like, our understanding of sacrifice is really overly simplified.
Yes.
I mean, a blood sacrifice would have been certainly something that happened, but to think it's just as simple as God requires this blood, it's as opposed to this is an act of faithfulness. I think it's important to understand that. That was really struck upon me in my recent trip to Israel, looking at the way grain fields were set up to have these corners where the poor could come and glean. Well, that's a testament of one's faithfulness to God. God doesn't necessarily require it. It is an act of faithfulness. And I think that actually maps onto what I believe Jesus is doing better than the substitutionary atonement. I think what really undermines substitutionary atonement for modern Christians is simply this question. If God is God and God has the capacity to be gracious, because God's God and can do that, why would God require anything to make use of that grace. And that's the one that burns people's heads, because it was the old, Old Testament vengeful God requires a sacrifice. Right. And so a lot of people have said, I've heard this said before, is like, if God requires death in order to offer grace, that's not a God I would worship. I don't know if you've ever heard people say things in that category, but I mean, that's why it's, substitutionary atonement, it's turn in the box to be examined. And I'm someone I am willing to say that I'm not there anymore. I can't necessarily say I fully believe in it. That doesn't mean I want to discard it, because it's, I still think there's some wrestling there.
Sure, of course. And one place I would point, and again, we've said this, but we're getting into Lent, to look at the Gospels. And just what is the focus in the story? I mean, Jesus dies in all four of the Gospels, but people are not walking away and pointing to, there's the thing that we build our faith on. It's the resurrection that we build, so much for our faith on. So I think that would be a place I would point people to as well.
Yeah. So for our last question, we had a couple questions about how do people of faith interact with social media? And it wasn't just, and a lot of them wasn't just how you behave on social media. It's what are we supposed to make of it, because it's making us so deeply unhappy. And I'm curious if you had any thoughts on that, or even personal experience of how you've managed that over the years. Yeah.
So I would take that a couple different directions. The first one for us is that we are streaming this podcast, and we are on YouTube doing this, and I think it's a great thing to be able to do that, and to be able to talk to folks and have these kinds of conversations in front of people we wouldn't otherwise be able to. So I would hold that up as one of the kind of good things going on. But it does not take very long at all to be on Facebook or Twitter and to see kind of this vitriol that is there, and people sharing so much information. And I'm thinking particularly politically, their social opinions about how the world should be structured and who should be in power, and and all of those things. And they are more often than not conversations. These are throwing barbs back and forth, and how could that not be damaging?
Yeah.
And so I think you were pointing to the question. So what do we do? For me personally, a lot of times I just don't engage with that at all.
Yeah.
I block it out, or I get off of whatever platform I'm on. But that's not really a way to navigate that, right?
It could be.
Yeah, it could be.
Yeah. Yeah. I heard a psychologist talk about some study where they were looking at mental health trends for teenagers in particular. And for whatever reason, there's theories on this, but 2014, things were getting better. All of a sudden something in 2014 hits and it starts going the other direction by pretty large factors. And the theory behind that has to do with, this is when we've reached sort of this zenith of where mobile technology is ubiquitous. So, mobile technology, obviously things like mobile Facebook and things like that have existed before 2014, but the accessibility due to things like family cell phone plans, more affordable versions of mobile phones that can access things. 2014 is when all those things sort of hit together, and you start getting, teenagers having access to social media on their phones all the time with, Snapchat, Facebook, Instagram, now TikTok, and all these sort of things, Twitter. And all of a sudden mental health scores start declining. And so to me, I'm almost of the point that I don't know if there is a healthy way to interact with some of them.
Interesting.
Now, the mental health scores and what people deem to be, how people classify their interactions with these platforms differ. Things like Instagram tend to be less harmful to people because there's not as much verbal interaction, or if it is, it's just like, oh, that's a beautiful picture. It's a little more geared towards that. But a lot of the other ones, the toxic score is just, it's terrible. And so, and there are studies that are specific to Facebook and other ones. And there's not a single study that is out there that points anywhere to any interaction with these things making people healthier.
Sure.
Mentally healthier. There's just no study that does it. And so I'm almost of the point of saying, like, why use it? If you're someone who doesn't have a Facebook account, keep it that way, because I don't think it's doing us any favors unless, here's the caveat I would say. There's two caveats. One, you're someone from a marginalized community, and that's a very broad definition. It could be something like you have a chronic illness and you need to meet other people with that. There's something unique or rare about you, and you need to find other people that have that. Facebook does provide, through groups, private groups, the ability to have that connection. I'm someone who, although I am a white male that is not marginalized, but I do have a chronic medical condition that I have found a good deal of camaraderie. And so I do have Facebook, but I interacted in such a specific way. And I actually have all these things. I lock out the feed. And so when I log on to Facebook, it's to check group messages, but I usually get that on my phone, and it's from people in that community, or it's to participate in those message groups. Outside of that, I do not use it. And I have a love-hate with Twitter. I delete it off my phone and I put it back.
Regularly.
Regularly. Yeah, many times I've texted Amy. I was like, well, deleted Twitter again. The problem with Twitter is I just use it as a news source.
Yes,
and it's really helpful for that. But maybe I just need to like cull who I follow down to a very small set of that. I think I'm really at the point where I just there's no value added to our lives. There's like, what's the point of having these things? If it's sharing pictures with family, fine. If it's sharing pictures with a friend, that's fine. But there's so many other things. Part of the reason mental health scores are so bad with particularly kids is they don't go to sleep. As a youth minister in the past, I'd talk to kids. I said, how much sleep are you getting at night? Knowing that they should be getting 9, 9, 10, 8, 9, 10, somewhere in there. They're getting like 4 or 5. And it's because this phone, it's not because of the blue light on the phone, which we were told, because studies have actually said that's not really part of it. It's the engagement. They're nervous about things. They're getting messages at 2 a.m. on Snapchat, things like that. If you're a parent, don't let your kid use their phone in their room by themselves. That's a piece of advice I say to everyone. It's hard because it's everywhere and it's not going to go away. But as Christians, it's not just, we have to be not just how we behave, but how it affects us. Because any other thing in our life, I think if we worked at a job of a toxic culture, we would be looking for another job, hopefully, if we felt like we could. Any other thing in our life, we would be trying to think about getting rid of it. If it was social media, we should be doing that. Yeah.
And I think so much of, even with it being very hard and people understanding these things on some level, it's a lot of times the fear of missing out. Like what am I, if I'm not on Facebook, even if I'm not on Instagram, and I agree with you that seems kind of calmer and kinder, maybe.
Yeah, my biggest worry with the Instagram is just time wasting.
Yes,
not necessarily
it's
making me unhappy.
Look at these sunsets; they're gorgeous.
Because the scroll never ends.
Yeah. So that would be a point that I would make too.
Yeah, it's complicated because it's not going to go away. But if it makes us unhappy, why are we doing it?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think another part of another part particularly challenged for Christians is we put so much energy into who we are performing online. So it's making sure we choose the right selfie, the right image, and it's this whole production. We are all our own PR agents. Now that's true everywhere. I think there's some people that now argue that the only identity we have is the one we perform. So even in interpersonal interactions, we are doing some degree of performativeness. But I think we could all admit that when we're with people we really trust, that performance is at its lowest, and that's when we are our most authentic selves. But I think we could also all admit online our most inauthentic self exists there. And as a Christian, particularly as we talk about integrity, shouldn't we want to be like limiting the amount of inauthenticity to ourselves? Because particularly if faith is a major component of how we interact online, that inauthenticity could be a problem, because that's one of the biggest complaints against Christianity. It's not authentic.
And I think if you have that kind of pressure to not be authentic, then you can never get to that kind of vulnerable place. We've talked about vulnerability before, and that may not sound like something that people want to do. Why would I want to get to the place of vulnerability?
Yeah.
But I think that's a place there where real change can happen, not just kind of this throwing opinions back and forth, but a place where real change can happen.
Well, now's the time of the show where we have some recommendations for you, things we've enjoyed, things we think you like. Let's start it off. Amy, what you got?
Yeah, so we are right there at the season of Lent. So one of the things that I actually kind of recalled, I've looked at it, I've used it before, but it's one of those things that I just kind of forgot. Interestingly enough, from our conversation about technology, it's a technology thing.
Okay.
But it's very specific, and it is a website, but also an app that can go on your phone that's called Pray As You Go. Have you heard of this before?
It sounds familiar, yeah.
Yeah, so there's a time for daily prayer, which would be maybe even a great practice during Lent. We have some of those that we are offering here from the church too. But this is kind of a series of like bells and music and beautiful landscapes that are very short. So if you want to be on your phone doing something, this would be a great thing to point you to.
It's a multi-sensory experience. Yep. Yeah, that's interesting. Yep. Yeah, and have you done this so far?
Yeah, so I've used this in the past, recalled it today, and I was like, oh, that's right. I really loved that. Yeah. Yeah.
I meant to say earlier in a discussion about social media, the timing of this being so near Lent, it is an interesting opportunity to experiment with yourself about, how is it affecting your life? And, a common practice in Lent to give things up. This might be a good time to just say, maybe not wholly give it up, but I'm going to delete all the apps off my phone and just see what happens. You might learn something about yourself. My recommendation is a documentary that's on HBO, so that might be limiting for some people, but it's called McMillions. And
this is the McDonald's.
Yes, it's amazing. This is mind-blowing that, I didn't know this till now, but, the Monopoly game at McDonald's where you could win $1 million and win all these really big prizes and things like that. The thing is, the vast majority of time it existed was a complete scam.
It's hard to believe.
There was just a small series of people that were essentially scamming all of us in McDonald's. McDonald's wasn't in on this, but this small set of people scamming that every $1 million winner for almost 20 years was a complete fraud. And even the big winners. And
it's
unreal how this happened for so long.
My childhood self is so disappointed.
I know. It's just like the promise of, you peel that off, and the promise, I just need one more, to think that I never had a shot. Not just the 1 in a million, 1 in 10 million. I never had a shot. And so it's really amazing. I'm not finished it. There's only 3 episodes out. And, it's a little extra, I'll say that. They've dialed it up a little bit, but man, is it entertaining. I hope it's something that gets a wider release at some point, that HBO maybe sells it or releases it somewhere else, because man, is it entertaining and really interesting.
Awesome.
So, well, like us, favorite us, share us with your friends, leave us a review on YouTube, on Google Play, on Apple iTunes, all those things. But thanks for joining us on Deep Dive. Any last thing, Amy?
All good.
Yeah, we answered all the questions great, right?
So many questions.
All right. Take care. See you next week.
Bye-bye.